Well, the orange man just won the US elections.
No!
And if you didn't spend the past year scrolling Reddit, perhaps this result wasn't too shocking. More importantly, Donald Trump comes with some serious potential changes for world politics. He has previously said that October 7 would not have happened under his leadership. So, now that he's president, what's next for the Israel and Palestine conflict? Well, to answer that question, we need to first rewind back time and go back to his first term as president. Trump enters office with his signature red tie and a plan to shake things up. And shake things up he did. First up, the embassy move. Trump recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital and shifted the US embassy there from Tel Aviv.
Last month, I also took an action endorsed unanimously by the US Senate just months before. I recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel.
Now, Jerusalem is a deeply contested city, sacred to Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike, and central to the Palestinian dream of a future state. For decades, US presidents played it safe, keeping embassies out of Jerusalem to avoid fueling tensions. Donald Trump, he said, why not? Critics predicted chaos, maybe even war. But when the sun rose the next morning, Jerusalem was still standing, and Trump looked like a man who could defy the laws of Middle Eastern diplomacy. Palestinians, however, were furious. For them, this was a slap in the face, a clear signal that the US was no longer even pretending to be neutral. For Israel, though, it was a triumph. Finally, a US president had openly legitimized their claim to their eternal capital. And for Trump, it was the first of many moves that proved he wasn't afraid to rip up the old rulebook. Then came the Golan Heights. This is a slice of land Israel captured from Syria back in 1967 and later annexed in 1981. An annexation that most of the world never recognized, but Trump did. He declared the Golan Heights Israeli territory, handing over legitimacy with the stroke of a pen. Syria, of course, was outraged, but it wasn't in a position to do much about it, bogged down as it was in its own civil war. For Israel, this was another big win. And for the world, it was a reminder that Trump was not about to let internal norms get in the way of his version of diplomacy. Donald Trump didn't stop there. The real headline grabber of his first term was the Abraham Accords. And before we get to that headline, if you're enjoying this video so far, please hit that subscribe button and help me get to my goal of 40,000 subs by the end of the year. Look, personally, I thought this was possibly one of the most significant plans for long-lasting peace I had seen in a very long time. In simple terms, this was Middle Eastern matchmaking at its finest. Under Trump's watch, Israel normalized relations with countries like the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco. Before this, Arab states had one big condition for dealing with Israel: make peace with the Palestinians first. Trump tore up that condition and said, let's make some deals. Suddenly, Israel and these Arab nations were shaking hands, signing trade deals, and launching direct flights. For Palestinians, though, it felt like a betrayal. They had been left out of the conversation entirely, watching their cause slip further into the shadows. But should the entire Middle East really be permanently in a cold war with Israel due to Palestine? And then there was Trump's so-called deal of the century, which was marketed as a bold attempt to finally resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The plan was ambitious on paper, but divisive in reality. Its stated goal was to end the conflict entirely and clear all claims from both sides. The framework offered Palestinians self-governance, but only on the condition that they would be stripped of any powers that could remotely challenge Israel's security. Jared Kushner, who was the primary force behind the Trump admin's Middle East efforts, compared the plan to the Marshall Plan, envisioning it as an economic revival for Palestinians, backed by $50 billion in investment. He believed tourism and development could transform the Palestinian economy. The proposal granted Israel sovereignty over all its settlements in the West Bank, effectively legitimizing them under international law. An unprecedented shift in US policy. This move obviously came on the heels of two earlier Trump administration decisions, recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital and stating that West Bank settlements were consistent with international law. These steps redefined the US position on the conflict, firmly aligning with Israel's perspective while sidelining Palestinian aspirations. For the Palestinians, the plan felt like a cruel joke. The Palestine Liberation Organization, or the PLO, dismissed the plan as a mirage of economic prosperity designed to entrench their captivity. Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh, who met his end only recently, outright rejected it. insisting that the land and Jerusalem were non-negotiable. Well, obviously to nobody's surprise. Kushner, ever pragmatic, responded to criticism by urging people to divorce themselves from history and focus on the future. He argued that Palestinian leaders needed to decide, did they want a better life, or would they squander yet another opportunity? Even the language of the plan underscored its rejection of traditional frameworks. It deliberately avoided the phrase two-state solution, which Kushner said meant different things to Israelis and Palestinians. In the end, the deal of the century was seen by many as a blueprint for solidifying Israel's dominance rather than a genuine pathway to peace. Israel embraced it as a green light for expansion, while the Palestinians walked away, leaving the idea of a two-state solution more fragile than ever. And while all this was happening, Trump took another bold step. He cut off aid to the Palestinians. His administration defunded UNRWA and halted US assistance to Palestinian territories. The reasoning? Why should we pay if they're not willing to play ball? Jared Kushner and the Trump administration argued that the agency perpetuated the refugee crisis instead of resolving it. To them, UNRWA's framework allowed refugee status to pass down through generations, creating a system of permanent camps that kept millions of Palestinians locked in a cycle of dependency. Kushner viewed this as not just inefficient but also detrimental to any hope of a long-term solution. He believed that by continuing to fund UNRWA, the international community was entrenching unrealistic demands like the Palestinian right of return, which would undermine Israel's security and sovereignty. The Trump administration's decision to defund UNRWA was, in part, an attempt to force the Palestinian leadership to negotiate on more pragmatic terms and to shift the focus from indefinite aid to self-reliance. Looking at the agency now, you could certainly see why there were serious concerns, but also why the decision to cut it off completely was so controversial.
No, not you. Not you. Your organization's terrible.
Of course, no discussion of Trump's first term in the Middle East would be complete without mentioning Iran, the head of the snake. Trump's maximum pressure campaign didn't just cripple Iran's economy, it sent shockwaves across the entire region. At its core, this strategy was designed to suffocate Iran's ability to fund its proxies, like Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon, both of which rely heavily on Iranian financial and military support. By slapping Iran with severe sanctions, Trump reduced its oil exports from millions of barrels per day to almost nothing, cutting off the regime's primary revenue stream. Kushner described this approach as essential to creating leverage in the Middle East. With Iran distracted by its collapsing economy, the regime was forced to focus internally, leaving it less capable of financing its regional ambitions.
The Iran deal was one of the worst and most one-sided transactions the United States has ever entered into. Frankly, that deal is an embarrassment to the United States, and I don't think you've heard the last of it, believe me.
Israel, unsurprisingly, celebrated these efforts. For them, a weakened Iran translated into fewer rockets and less support for groups openly committed to their destruction. But there was a dark side to the maximum pressure strategy. Iran didn't take the sanctions lying down. Instead, it retaliated through a series of covert and proxy attacks, targeting US allies, energy infrastructure, and even US forces in Iraq. The resulting tension brought the US and Iran perilously close to outright conflict. At its peak, this strategy felt like a high-stakes game of geopolitical chicken, with both sides testing how far they could push without triggering an all-out war. Kushner argued that the pressure on Iran also laid the groundwork for the Abraham Accords. With Iran isolated and less of a direct threat, Arab states like the UAE and Bahrain felt more confident normalizing ties with Israel, focusing on regional cooperation rather than fear of Iranian aggression. Critics, however, contended that the policy lacked a clear endgame. While it undeniably hurt Iran, it did little to curb their nuclear ambitions or permanently dismantle their proxy networks. Instead, it created an atmosphere of heightened tension, with a region on edge waiting for the next provocation, and that provocation likely came on October 7 of last year. In fact, many believe the Saudis potentially becoming an official signatory of the Abraham Accords forced Iran's proxy Hamas to launch this attack. Overall, Trump's strategy wasn't about hand-holding or gradual diplomacy. It was about delivering blunt force messages. For Israel, such a strategy was a win. You could tell, judging by the fact that they named an Israeli settlement in the Golan Heights. Well, Trump Heights. For the Palestinians, caught in a broader realignment of Middle Eastern alliances, It was yet another sign that the US was prioritizing Israel's interests above all. And for the rest of the world, it was a reminder that Trump's foreign policy didn't play by the usual rules, and neither did its consequences. Donald Trump's cabinet picks almost certainly imply that these strategies will continue. Elise Stefanik was picked as the ambassador to the UN. If you recall, she was the one who demolished the heads of universities, namely Claudine Gay, the former president of Harvard. Mike Huckabee, the new admin's ambassador to Israel, is another staunch supporter of Israel and likely would not, for lack of better words, take much shit from Hamas. The rest of Trump's cabinet further solidifies this direction. Figures like Mike Waltz, Pete Hegseth, and Marco Rubio represent hawkish views on Iran, with some advocating for preemptive military action to prevent Tehran from developing nuclear weapons. Their collective approach reinforces Trump's maximum pressure doctrine, crippling sanctions, and a willingness to escalate if needed. Egypt's President Sisi and Jordan's King Abdullah, leaders of Arab states with peace agreements with Israel, are uneasy. They worry that Trump's policies could destabilize the region further, potentially leading to mass expulsions of Palestinians into their countries and threatening their political and economic stability. For Gulf monarchies, however, this situation is less concerning. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and others seem comfortable with Trump's picks, viewing them as reliable allies in the shared goal of containing Iran. Yet, Trump's return to office raises the specter of renewed conflict between the US and Iran, which could spill over into their territories and inflame their youthful population. One critical factor to consider now is that Hamas has almost entirely been decimated. This could open the door to negotiations without the destructive influence of radical hardliners. As I've mentioned on this channel before, what's desperately needed from the Palestinian side is pragmatic, forward-thinking leadership that moves away from radicalization. The reality is stark. Palestinians cannot afford another 50 years of poverty, funneling aid into weapons and clinging on to the dream of Israel's destruction. That path only leads to perpetual devastation. Perhaps, in a twist of irony, Trump's tough love approach, what some might call strict parenting, is exactly what could push the region towards a more stable and constructive future. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. You can also see more from the channel right here. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.